I love my mum. She just came up knowing fully well that I was about to start recording, and she gave me both a packet of crisps and a sandwich. And that thought is just so nice. I love her for it. You can't ask for a better mum than my mum. Hello Internet, I'm Oliver Worley from Ikarus's workshop, and me and my friends were discussing not too long ago, a couple of weeks that is, about whether languages can be simply better than other languages. Is there is it possible to place one language simply better than the other? Okay, and this, wasn't really an argument, but we disagreed. Okay, and since then I've been doing a lot of thinking on the matter, just trying to structure and work out why I think I'm right. And I'm here to argue that I do think some languages are simply better than others, and it doesn't matter the context in which the language evolved from, it simply matters the way that they can be used. So I came to the conclusion that when thinking about language, there are certain criteria that need to be established to determine whether a language is good or not. Now, obviously, like most things, all criteria is there's so many different factors that get involved with determining whether it's good or not. So many that it's impractical to take them all into account. So instead, most people just look at the more significant factors. And I've arranged some of the ones that came to my mind immediately, though I do believe there are probably others out there that are just as important, if not more important. But I've got a couple that kind of come to mind. Now, the first thing about languages that need to be understood is they are a way to communicate ideas, thoughts, whatever. They're conveying information from one party to another party. Okay, and for that, there are certain things need to be met. The criteria that I established, or that came to mind anyway, was speed of communication. People, misvalue that a lot, and I think being able to communicate fast in a responsive situation is very, very valuable for any sort of society to have. I also had a clarity of communication, being able to present your ideas clearly without misunderstanding each other. The variety of ideas. There are plenty of languages historically that don't actually allow certain concepts to be presented just because of the way they're structured, and so it disincentivizes or incentivizes certain kind of perspectives on life. And I think that the best language is one that incorporates it generally and allows the individual to make whatever inference they want, or make whatever statement they want when they make a statement. I don't want someone to be limited by not saying them. I want to do something. A collective language, for example, I think is a disadvantage to the language inherently. As I say, there are of course other factors that are important and need to be considered, but they're the main fundamental ones. And here's how and another thing that I think is important is when you're judging a language, you don't judge it on the average of any of these factors or of all of its factors. You instead judge it by the worst of these factors. And my reasoning for this is when a language exists, communication, for example, its primary function being communication. Communication requires a number of different features to work in tandem for the communication to work. For example, so the torch on my phone just gave up, so I'm going to have to look orange now, which is, orange is a good colour, I can live with it. And I've already forgotten what I was saying. So, as I was saying about factors having to work in tandem for communication. So communication relies on these factors to work in tandem together. One factor, for example, speed, is only as valuable as the clarity of the words that it conveys. It doesn't matter how quickly you can, convey information if no one understands it, and vice versa. It doesn't matter how fast... Oh, dog's barking. And vice versa. It doesn't matter how how clear you can communicate an idea if it takes 6 years to do so. I really like bringing up fantasy languages just because they're really good at kind of exaggerating certain points. And I think Entish is a brilliant example of a bad language, objectively wrong, just a bad one. And and it comes down very much to the how long it takes to communicate, because a language is not like within its own factor. Is it functions within the world and the environment. It's a way of communicating ideas within that. Okay, it has to essentially work both with the people that are using the language to communicate and the world around it. So, though Entish, for example, works very well with the Ents to communicate between them, it doesn't work well as soon as anything that is not Ent related occurs, such as the War of the Ring or Sauron. Their language would have limited them so much. I mean, it took a full day to say good morning, which is far too long to respond to any significant crisis. If an earthquake or a forest fire was happening and they were trying to warn each other, or that heading in one direction will get them killed, and instead they've got to head south to avoid the fire. If it takes them a full 8 hours to say that, then that language is bad, and those Ents will die because of the language, not because of anything else. Because that language is a thing that limited their ability to survive. When it's the language that's at fault for such a thing, that language can be considered bad. And you can quite easily determine in the factor, in this case, the speed of communication. Now, like always, there are exceptions, or at least context that needs to be understood to all of these rules. There are languages, for example, that aren't designed with clear and effective communication in general circumstances. Yodeling, for example, or like ritual languages. They're ritual languages, for example. They have a very specific purpose in mind to, either create this sense of wonder and awe, or this kind of feeling of respect, or to convey simple but clear messages across vast distances. I mean, yodeling, in my opinion, though it obviously doesn't fit within the criteria of being clearly communicating a variety of ideas, it does, however, communicate massively over long distances, and is easy to convey information very quickly amongst a lot of people without any technology. And so within its field of context, it's a good language. And I think exceptions can exist in, there. But generally, it is still considered a bad language, in terms of general use. It's not good for, telling someone they need to go and get eggs from the shops. It's good for telling another, farmer across the other side of the mountains that there's a dust storm coming and they just can't see it because the mountain's in the way. It's got value. I'm not saying languages don't have value if they, have significant drawbacks. What I'm saying is they have a purpose, but it's limited. And generally, you want and you often want a more general language to function. Now, to justify my ideas on like certain points, okay, I've already said some of them. For example, there. To justify my criteria, as I've already discussed a couple, but generally, this is kind of why I think the 3 points that I came up with are useful. Speed in itself is kind of self-explanatory, okay? And I've already said, if it takes you 6 years to tell, everyone around you that if they run from the fire by going up north, they're gonna, get caught off and never be able to flee again. If it takes too long to say that, then, the language has limited your ability to survive and function effectively in your world. And that is a flaw with the language. So speed, out of the way. Clarity is kind of obvious, if someone cannot simply understand what you're saying, okay, despite knowing the language, then there is something wrong inherently with the language. If the language, for example, has lots of similar sounding words, that means, I think we've all seen those like memes or whatever on the internet where there's like a sentence in one language, which makes perfect sense, and then in another it's just the same sound repeated, often spelt differently, but it's like 12 of those words just listed one after another, and it's meant to say something specific, like the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog, but instead it just sounds like voo 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 voo. That's that sort of thing. If that's a feature of a language that exists, then that is a detriment to the language because it limits clarity. And of course, variety. I've always liked the idea of being able to have as many options when it comes to speaking as possible. Now, I'm not talking about 100 different words for the same thing. I'm talking about 100 different things that there are words for. I mean, in Old Hebrew, for example, there wasn't a language for I. Anything that considered you individually was, I don't actually know the context, so forgive me if I say something incorrect here, but I seem to remember from a conversation I had with one of my parents that anything to do with an individual I was to do with the Hebrew gods. So as you as an individual could not refer to yourself at all, really. That might be, now I might have got this mixed up with another language, but the idea is still reminiscent, the idea is still true. The fact that by not being able to communicate that you are an individual means that you will not think of yourself as one, and you can't, or more realistically, you can't think of yourself as one. And as such, you are restricted to a horde mentality, a community mentality. Now, whether that might be preferable or not is a different debate. The idea that you can't have a choice because of the words of the language that you use, I think is an inherent flaw. Obviously, other features, exist, but that's my general premise anyway. Now, a counter argument that one of my friends had in regards to this topic is that all languages function equally within their given context. So, French convey information perfectly fine, with other French, just as well as English convey with Englishmen, or Russians with Russians. And then the idea being that a language, when within its, sphere and own environment, is just as effective. And I disagree. I don't think that that holds up. I think if, to kind of take an extreme example again, okay, if one language, Entish, was to take six years to, tell someone to run, then in that environment, okay, there is still limitations. Everything is slow. And, obviously being too fast is a problem, okay, but slow to the point of impracticality is still slow to the point of impracticality, and the language is the thing that's the consequence for that. And so the language is at fault. So it doesn't matter, I don't believe anyway, that a language within its own field is just as good. I mean, if that language I said about sounding like voo 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 voo, okay, that language within its own context, spoken to someone who also speaks that language, okay, would also misunderstand what you're saying. It doesn't matter. And so I do think that argument that my friend came up with is flawed based on those very principles. Just because a language is culture specific and works within a culture doesn't mean that, a better language could not work better. A different language would not work better, maybe is a better way of saying it. So I don't believe it stands up when kind of thought about. Now, I haven't thought very in depth about these. I've thought a lot about these concepts, but not heavily in depth. And so, obviously criticism and more ideas being presented is, valuable, and I'd appreciate. But generally, I think I've got the premise sorted. I also spoke to my mum about this topic. And while she agreed that some languages can be better than others, she also said it needs to take into account how the language is employed by the beings or the states or the controlling factors that can educate and all that sort of stuff. And it's an interesting consideration. The idea that the powers that be, incentivize certain ways of thinking by presenting certain ideas, I think is very useful. But I don't think that's relevant to the actual validity of the language specifically. Okay, and that is a lot more to do with the people and things surrounding that language. The people who are incentivizing certain uh, schools of thought, or in disincentivizing types of actions. Now, if the language was at fault, if the language didn't allow for you to say that you wanted to go to the shops, okay, then that would be the language's fault. However, if the language allowed such a thing to happen, and yet the controlling factors disincentivize that, then that would be the fault of the controlling factors. That does, however, lead to an interesting consideration of, because languages, there's obviously a formalized version of languages, but there's also an informalized version, which is the kind of accepted standard, a language that everyone uses and understands, regardless of the grammatical, applications. My mum presented another argument, another idea. She presented the idea that if I say the apple tastes good, grammatically that's wrong, because the apple cannot taste. It's not living. It doesn't have a tongue. It can't taste anything. However, we all know exactly what I mean when I say the apple tastes good. We all know that I like the taste of the apple, or the apple is fresh, We can make those assumptions, but what it does mean is that technically there are two languages in this instance. And so when I'm talking about objective value of languages, I think it needs to be considered that, all of the languages that exist, German, Russian, French, Nigerian, all of them have essentially a second value, more like a casual version. Now, in legal common law, there are three technical, for English anyway, there are three technical languages: legal, non-legal, and slang. Now, slang does not specifically mean, or sorry, let me correct that. Legal, standard English, and slang. Legal is obviously to do with all the law stuff, and it's complicated and hellish, and no one likes it unless you're a lawyer. Standard English is essentially the kind of base structure, how it's meant to work, as it were. And slang is how everyone ends up using it, regardless of its intended use or its intended application, or its design anyway. It's kind of the natural evolution of the language. So when we talk about language, I think we can rule out legal language from this point, because it's much more to do with contract things, and it's not really designed for general communication. It's got a very specific purpose in mind, very much like yodeling or the ritual languages. In many cases, you might say it is a ritual language. That I suppose could be an argument for another day. But I think legalese goes with that bracket. As for the other two, okay, I think slang is the one that we would consider that we would be using. I mean, I've been talking in slang. I know very well that I've messed up. I've put, incorrect grammar uses all over the place, and I haven't quite finished sentences, or I've done something wrong. What I'm saying is slang, though I do hope that most of you can understand the ideas that I'm trying to get across. And of course, standard English is what's written down in the dictionary and all that. So when I'm thinking about if English was a good or a bad language, I'd have to consider both separately. And I suppose I could consider them all together as well. I suppose that's a possibility. The similarities. I mean, I suppose it tells you something about the language by being able to compare the slang variation to the original standard variation. You can compare how much of a divergence there is from the standard language, and kind of work out the sort of. I don't suppose it's too valuable alone. You'll need other evidence, but you could work out the kind of mentality of the people that use the language. You could work out the kind of history or changes that have happened on the way. It's an interesting concept. Still, the premise remains two separate languages that needs to be considered separate. Now, of course, this tendency in thinking leads you to think, are you arrogant, or more particularly, am I arrogant enough to actually create a list and judge which languages I think are better than others? Now, I'm not a linguist. I'm not I don't even speak another language. I mean, I know Privyet or Guten Tag, I know that the former is Russian and the latter is German, but I could not hold a conversation. So, while yes, I am arrogant enough to kind of place different values on languages, I don't think that I have the knowledge to actually create some sort of structure or algorithm or anything that you can create to determine the value of language. However, I do believe that it's possible it's possible to create a list of which languages are better than others. Is it worth doing? Is it valuable? Will it be useful information? Probably not. You're not going to convince whole populations of people to give up their own everything, their whole ability to speak just because one is slightly more efficient than others. And I've been using Entish as an example for a bad language, but in reality the difference between languages I think is much, much smaller than the different, the flaw that Entish has. And so I don't think the effort to change what language, the languages is worth it. I think most languages function well, well enough to allow for all sorts of communication. And though all languages have their own funny sort of messed up malarkey, England is famous for having rules that it just break. English is famous for having rules that it breaks left, right, and centre. But it doesn't stop people from being able to understand what's being said. And so most languages communicate effectively. Still, some are better than others. And I believe, and I do believe what I've what I've said justifies that, or has a logical coherence to it that allows it to make sense. Even so, that's my premise. I'm going to go and mock my friends with this and, tell them that I've done really, really well. And they're going to come up with some sort of reasonable argument. I mean, if you've got any counter arguments or further ideas, please post them below. I'm an angsty teenager with no knowledge of anything other than what I've, I'm just an angsty teenager, an awkward teenager who thinks my views are worth listening to. So go and hit me in the comments, and I'll think about it. And if a good, enough of them are these counter arguments come about, I'll probably make another video either addressing them or agreeing, depending on how my mind changes. But yeah, that's it. I'm gonna awkwardly sign off. So au revoir.